Let's briefly consider designing surveys and interviews as possible approaches to data collection. So the following basic approaches are possible, and you will need to decide which best fits your purpose, facilities available, and your research schedule. So let's consider surveys. Now, this can be conducted literally on a one-to-one basis, where the researcher stands in front of somebody and asks questions and writes down their responses to these oral questions. You need to ensure that you write them down legibly and in a consistent format for review later on. So that's one way of using a survey on a one-to-one face-to-face basis. So surveys can be conducted by using paper questionnaires, where you hand out the questionnaire to somebody, or of course in these days it could be a paper or an electronic online questionnaire. A disadvantage of this approach is that there isn't the one-to-one contact, the verbal dialogue that can be had to help clarify, to ask questions, ensure that the participant understands what's being asked. Although the major advantage over oral one-to-one interface use of surveys is that paper-based or electronic questionnaires have the possibility to address a much greater sample of people in a particular given period of time. Interviews, predominantly undertaken on a one-to-one basis or one-to-few live discussions conducted by the interviewer. They're usually operating from an interview schedule, and the interview schedule lists questions that have to be asked in a particular order. Although interviews are very time-consuming, the face-to-face situations can produce a more considered response from the participants than questionnaire answers can achieve. And also with interviews, there's the opportunity to clarify the meaning of questions to the participant or prompt relevant answers via follow-up questioning. It should be noted that the comment related to time-consuming is quite applicable because interviews take time to set up, to arrange for participants to be at a certain place at a certain time, hopefully piloted or trialed beforehand. And then, of course, there's the time for the actual interview, which you've got to prepare for. Make sure the room is allocated, make sure it's prepared, ready for the interview. Then you've got to undertake the interview, etc. All that takes time. And then also the data gathering exercise. If you take notes during the interview, you have to keep focus on the interview. You have to make sure your notes are something that can easily be read later on. They're in a coherent order. They relate to the questions being asked. And if you're recording the interviews and then transcribing them later on, you need to allow sufficient time to transcribe the interviews, as that's a very time-consuming process, particularly if you've got 5, 6, 7 interviews to transcribe. You could be considering weeks and weeks to transcribe interviews on a part-time basis. Another option is the use of focus groups. These are small discussion groups, typically 4 to 6 members. The participants are led by the researcher or a moderator and asked to comment on a statement or a question or a situation. This approach does allow the researcher to account for several viewpoints taken at the same time and to observe the outcomes of what's sometimes termed free and dynamic discussion amongst focus group members. A forum or a workshop can carry out a similar function to focus groups, but this might consist of more members. Often this has a wider diversity of views, and consequently there can be a loss in the clarity of the answers gained from such events. I found this in the book that you've got from Pearson. I think this is some really good points here. It relates to generating survey questions. They call it 6 common rules here, and they all seem quite valid to me, that what they're highlighting here, just to be aware of if you're going to generate a questionnaire or you're going to generate an interview schedule. So irrespective of the method used to ask questions, these common principles apply. So the first thing is to keep the interview or survey, meeting, whatever, as short as possible. With interviews, I just said there, you really want to try and keep them as short as possible, because if you're going to transcribe the interviews, which often researchers do, then if you've got an interview that goes on for an hour and a half, 2 hours, there's a lot of transcription in there. I mean, from my sort of typical interviewing with students, I would normally get 45 minutes, I found, interviewing students, and that can take me best part of a month to write up, a month to 6 weeks even to write that up. I do verbatim, I record the sessions and then write them up verbatim, ums and ahs and expletives, everything goes into the transcript. Obviously having a full-time job, I've got to find time to do that, and it can take me 4 to 6 weeks to write one transcript of 45 minutes duration. So, and it depends on the personal circumstances. But just bear in mind that they do take a while to transcribe if you're going to transcribe them. So keeping your interviews and even your surveys. If you do a lengthy survey, you may not get much of a response from people. I've done surveys recently, and I'm on page 6 of 24, I think it said, and I'm sort of thinking about giving up. So keep your surveys as best you can, as short as possible, and use a minimum number of questions to try and obtain your information. So don't waste the time of the participants or, of course, your own time because what you're doing. Hint 2 there, it says only ask a question if you have a clear idea of how you will use the information obtained. Now that to me is all about the research questions. You're only having interviews, you're undertaking interviews because you're trying to answer the research questions, and you're saying that an interview is useful for obtaining the data to answer the research questions. So do make sure that your interview schedule or your questionnaire questions, they're all focused on trying to answer what you've put down as your research questions or your main objectives of your study. So that means kind of thinking through very carefully the various ways people might answer the questions. And it's quite an art trying to write questions. It really is in the schedule to make sure that they're very specific and they're answering exactly what you want. So you need to sort of think through very carefully all the possible answers you might obtain and how you might analyse them when you come to do your data analysis. Once you've got your data collected, how are you actually going to use it, how are you going to analyse it? So be very focused with the questions you're asking and ensure all the questions are unambiguous. That might sound obvious, but I actually was in the presence of a researcher years and years ago as a professor, and he was talking to his colleague in the classroom, and they were quite disappointed as they'd had results from a survey and issued a survey, and yet a couple of the questions on there were ambiguous. And they were very disappointed that they had done this survey and they couldn't really go and do it again. But there was 2 questions where really the results were not relevant at all because people had interpreted the question in a way that they hadn't perceived. It's probably because they probably rushed the questionnaire out because due to the pressure they're on. But nevertheless, now they're in a situation where you can't really go back and survey all these people again, and you've got to kind of deal with the situation, make the best of the information you've got. So you do need to think through up front, as best you can, are the questions I'm asking on a questionnaire or are the questions I'm going to ask in an interview, is it clear? An interview's a little bit better because if you get a response that you didn't expect, you can kind of clarify, as we said before. But certainly with a questionnaire, you can't do that kind of thing. So it's a bit like when you're doing any kind of report, if you're in a study for 6, 8, 10 months or whatever, and you're producing a report, you're so into it. When you issue the report, you might not put enough information in it for the person that is reading it to understand what's going on because you are so au fait with what you've done. So you've got to kind of think of your audience when you write a report and make sure they have all the basic knowledge they need that you take for granted in the report. And same kind of thing with generating questions. You've got to make sure that the participants will understand what you're asking them and will give you answers that relates to your study. So be very careful with generate your questions. Hint 4 is the order in which the questions are asked as well. It suggests you should move from the general to the specific nature of questions. And what they're trying to get at here is don't lead your interviewee. You've got to let them do the talking. So you ask the question and they respond to you, and you try not to give them up front indication of what your research has already found. I fall into that trap where I've actually started an interview with a student, and I've started saying about what I found in the previous interviews, and I suddenly realised, well, that's just like contaminating the data. I'm telling this interviewee about what the last one said, but I don't want to flavour. They might come up with something totally different now, but if I've told them what the last person said, then I'm kind of giving them information that they'll probably give back to me. Then they'll focus on what I've said about the last interview. So that's a real no-no. That's not the thing to do. So when you're doing your interview schedule, you kind of have your generic questions up front, and then you work more to specific questions after. You kind of know what information you're expecting to get in most cases. So don't tell the interviewee up front what you want. Try and get them to tell you. And later on, if that's not coming out, then you might want to induce it and find out why they haven't perhaps mentioned what you thought they were going to mention, and there might be reasons for that. Okay, so just try and avoid putting potential answers into the participant's consciousness, because that kind of contaminates the data. So be careful of that. 5, it says about considering appropriate demographic information. Make sure you obtain that from the interview. And I would always do that. If you're doing lots of interviews, you want to get sort of ages, you want to get their backgrounds, maybe their education in my case, what their past education was, and so on. So demographic information is very useful when you've got lots of interviewees to consider. Somebody was doing something last year in this unit, and it was looking at leadership in the workplace, and something that came out of the findings there after the interviews were undertaken is how older people, or people that have been at the company a long time, obviously had a sort of a different perspective on leadership than people that were just sort of relatively new to the company. So the age, lengths of service flavoured the way they approached their consideration of leadership was an issue there. So having that demographic information can be very useful sometimes. It actually can form part of your findings to some extent. The last one they've put there is a really good one, though not always easy to do, but it's actually try and pilot the questions and the methods you're using before you actually undertake the research. Now, that's not always easy to do that, but it is quite beneficial, because you can then try your questions out and see the kind of responses you get and see if it's what you expect that you are going to get. It can also give you an idea of the time it will take. I've never really sort of trialed an interview. I've trialed questionnaires, but I never really trialed an interview before I've done an interview, really. But I can see the relevance of doing that, really. So those 6 little points are actually quite useful little points to consider, whether you're generating a questionnaire or you're generating an interview schedule. I would suggest to sort of browse those again and just think through your questions and see if you've complied with those 6 points here. What I was going to do very briefly, trying not to bore you here, I was just going to take you through how I generate an interview schedule for the research I did a few years ago, which was related to, the title here is How Well Do Vocational Qualifications, like your HND for example, help prepare technician engineering students for undergraduate study. That was the title of the article here. So I was just going to show how how the interview schedule developed. And like I say with qualitative work, it evolves a little bit. It's not something perhaps that if you're doing a scientific study, you have your hypothesis, you have your experimental documented procedures and so on, you do it, you get your findings, you report on the findings and say did or didn't prove the hypothesis. That's very kind of structured, and as engineers we're quite used to that. But qualitative work is not that clear cut. So we have to kind of evolve the methodology, if you like, to what we're doing, evolve the methods. And that's kind of what happened here, you'll see, with the interview. It kind of evolved over a period of time. These were my research questions that I asked myself when I started to study. RQ1 was to understand the range of possible problems technician engineering students who have studied college-based vocational qualifications can experience when they progress to university or undergraduate study. That was the first one. So that's a more generic overview of problems they're going to have. And RQ2 was to understand the specific impact that vocational assessment practice can have on technician engineering students' progressions, preparedness for undergraduate study. And my third one was to come up with recommendations. But so the first 2 there, RQ1, RQ2, was really what my interview schedule was kind of aiming at. I wanted to find out information from the interviewees. It was 10 interviewees over 15 years. I think it was 10 to 15 people I'd interviewed over a period of time for their reflections on studying at college and then going to university. That was what it was all about. And these are some of the thoughts that I went through when I was trying to generate my what I've termed my semi-structured interview. Now, there are several different types of interview you can use. There's a structured interview, a more quantitative research method, where the researcher or the interviewer has a set of prepared closed-end questions that they rigidly ask to all participants. At the other end of the spectrum, we have unstructured interviews. These are interviews where the researcher or the interviewer does not have predefined questions, but will generate and modify questions in the flow of the natural conversation between the researcher and the participants. And the one that's sort of in the middle is a semi-structured interview, where you do have a list of questions and you do ask the questions, but you do allow the participants to talk around the question. Sometimes they may go off a slight tangent. Sometimes it might be totally irrelevant to what you want, but you kind of let them go there to sort of make the conversation flow in the interview and engage with them. And sometimes it can highlight issues you never thought of and that perhaps you should be considering. So I like semi-structured interviews because they have that kind of flexibility in them that you can or cannot sort of allow this meandering. But these were some of the considerations I had to think about when I was generating the interview schedule. So thinking about the background to the students that were being interviewed, because they obviously had different entry qualifications to university. I did initially try to interview students that were going from school to university as well as from college, but the school became a difficult thing to do. I didn't interview a few students, but I didn't really have access to people coming from school so well, and my main focus was really on college and vocational qualifications, so the school part got dropped eventually. But initially I did have people coming from school and progressing from school and college to university. That's part of the study. I also had a situation where students were partway through their university when they came to be interviewed, because obviously, I have to be flexible when people can be interviewed from my point of view and their point of view. So I'd mentioned to people that had studied at college that had progressed to university, would they come back and talk to me? And some were quite keen to do it. Some were coming back to me within 3 months of being at university, so that was a slight issue. Some were coming back to me after the first year to university. Some I wasn't interviewing until they studied completely at university. And then some people had studied a few years ago at university and then were coming back to me. So I had all these kind of different considerations about how the interview schedule, because I wanted a very similar interview schedule for all of them, but how it could accommodate the backgrounds of the people, of the interviewers I was considering. So, studying partway through the year, I've got studying at the end of the first year. Some had just completed their degree program. There were students that entered directly into the second year of university, didn't do the first year, they went straight to the second year. So how does that affect my interview schedule? Some completed the degree program many years previously to the interview, so they had time had elapsed since they'd finished studied at university. Then I had people that were studying degrees in different disciplines: mechanical, electrical, mechatronics. A few people studying mechatronics. How do I deal with that with my interview schedule? Some students were going to red brick universities, some were going to post-92 universities. So how does that affect my degree schedule? I even had a couple of people that were studying the franchise degree program at college. So they studied at college and then they studied the degree program through college. There were interviewees that came back to see me twice in different times in their studies. So how does that work with an interview schedule? Do you ask the same interview schedule twice, do you? Or do you have a different one for that kind of thing? And one that I found particularly difficult was to interview students who had failed their university studies. And that was difficult. Trying to have an interview schedule where I could accommodate talking to people who had just come back from university and known they'd failed, and that was it kind of thing. So what I'm trying to get at, there's a lot of background information to think about how you generate an interview schedule. I'm trying to answer my research questions. So for RQ1 and RQ2, I need to answer those. I need to form an interview schedule that will kind of get me some data related to that. But I've got to account for my spectrum of interviewees I'm likely to get, and this was over a 10-year period. So a lot of things were changing in that time. So again, you need to sort of think through the backdrop to your interviews. Are you interviewing senior people? Are you? I know somebody last year was saying they were interviewing senior management and very daunted by interviewing senior management because the student had really control of the situation the manager was in to some extent, and so that's a difficult thing for them to manage, and they were quite worried about that. So even that sort of scenario has to be thought through, how you're going to deal with that sort of situation. When it looked at assessments, because assessment was my second RQ, I had to have assessment methods on my interview schedule. There was a variety of things to think about there. It literally was the variety of the assessment methods that could be used. There's weightings, different universities have different weightings. There's formative feedback opportunities, reset opportunities. Also, there was the sort of comparison between college assessment practice and university assessment. I wanted to pick up the pros and cons from the student's perspective. So a lot of things to think about there, and how I'm going to ask questions about that will give me the information. And also, I was interested in culturalization into university life, and how did these college students from a remote island community integrate into university life. There was that was an aspect. How did that impinge on their progression? So there's also sorts of issues like the cohort size they were in, the work ethic of required demographics. One thing that interests me is any other BTEC students they met. In hardly any student I interviewed met another BTEC student at university. It was quite interesting. Also, the support available to access lecturers, support available for mathematics, for example. And again, college comparison between the support they had at college and support at university. All these kind of issues were floating around when I was trying to generate the. And as for trialing the question, I was thinking about trialing because I did actually trial the questions. I didn't sort of think of it at the time, but when I think back, I did trial the questions, or a lot of the questions, because in the early 2000s, I was actually undertaking one-to-one interviews, and my interest in assessment practice and in students' progression developed through the interviews I was having. So some of the questions that I was using in the tutorials with the students at college formed my interest in the research that I undertook, and they sort of underpin the research questions I showed you. And of course, some of those questions were implicitly trialed with the students, because although I wasn't asking them directly about university study, there were questions I was asking them about their background and why they came to college and all this kind of stuff, and their aspirations, because some were saying they wanted to go to university. There were certain sort of questions that I was kind of, in a way, trialing that formed eventually part of the interview schedule that I was using. So I guess I did trial to some extent some of the questions. So because the interview schedule worked fairly well, I found, I used it. Even where there was a gap between interviewees, I found just using the same interview schedule, I kind of felt I was back on track. That's kind of really what it's for. So this is the actual interview schedule I use. I'm not going to spend long on this, but just to show you the kind of interview schedule that you might want to produce. Obviously, your topic area or discipline is totally different. I'm just trying to show you the thought process I'm going through, because maybe the thought process are a bit similar to what you might have to go through. I would normally sit with a student opposite me on the table, and again, the ethical issue about interviewing, if you're dealing with students, you have to kind of keep a distance from them. You shouldn't really be interviewing alone, but what can you do when you want to do one-to-one interviews? It's very difficult to have other people in the room. I did, though, make sure my line manager and my colleagues were aware of the research I was involved with, and so the interviews I was undertaking with the students. I had my laptop in front of me, so I was always typing where it says student response. I was typing very briefly into the response box, but I was actually recording all interviews. I asked permission for the student, could I record the session, that I would write it up and send them a copy of it. And so I was recording everything, but I was making notes as I go along, just generic notes, almost sometimes one or two words in those response boxes to give me a sort of memory jog later on. But the first part of my interview schedule, and I'd encourage you to do the same if you're interviewing, is to outline the ethical considerations that you're under. The person has a right to withdraw from the study. They can withdraw any time. They could walk out the interview there and then if they want to. They can withdraw later on when they see their transcript. They can always might have the right to withdraw. You've got to make sure that you'll tell them that you'll keep the information confidential. If you use it in a report, if you use a quote from them, you'll make sure that they cannot be identified. Their anonymity will be assured. My first sort of 5 minutes almost of my discussion on my interview schedule was all about outlining the guidelines I was under and the ethical stance that I had. And then my first batch of questions, in my case, were sort of background questions. I was kind of trying to get the interviewee to relax a little bit. In most cases, I found they were quite keen to be interviewed. They seemed to want to tell me their story, which was nice, but nevertheless sort of relax them a little bit. Some very straightforward questions talking about their entry qualifications that they had to university, and why did they study at college and not in school, for example. So very sort of background information questions there for my first sort of 5 or so questions, sort of to get them into the interviewing process. And then my kind of real nitty-gritty questions started in question 6. Now I'm interested in the questions that pertain to their university study. So I've got all my questions here. And again, if you look at these questions and you look at my research questions, you'll see that they're very structured. These questions, generally speaking, are focused on the research questions. I'm asking about their transition from school or college to university, both academic and cultural perspective. Talk about the academic background of the people that they're with. Looking at the main advantages, main disadvantages of their college study to helping them prepare for university study. Talk about the main assessment methods they have at university. How do they differ from school or college? The weightings and so on involved. The size of the groups I'm interested in. The support they got from lecturing staff. You can see I'm kind of asking questions here that really are underpinning my research questions all the way through the schedule. Now, I had a lot of questions here, and the reason for that is because some of the questions emanated from the tutorials I had done many years ago, and so there was lots of questions that I was kind of interested in to do with computer software, to do with sort of particular techniques that are involved at university. Now, I didn't ask all these questions. I think there's about 24 questions here. I wouldn't ask 24 questions in my interview, but nevertheless, I would probably ask about the first 13, 14 questions maybe. But thereafter, the ones after, I would only ask if I thought they were relevant to particular students' study that they'd undertaken. They were only if I had time and later questions about the experimental work in the software package. That was something that came out of student tutorials that I was sort of interested in, and sort of anecdotal evidence I'd heard from other students that had gone to university. And I just had those questions in the backdrop in case I just wanted to ask them. Maybe something come up in the conversation that sort of rang a bell with one of those questions, and I might then pursue that question. But certainly I would suggest up to question 14 for most students was the kind of where I was kind of progressing my interview schedule. So every interviewee would have experienced those questions, and then maybe more questions thereafter. And of course, because it was a semi-structured interview, I may have threw in some additional questions if I felt they were pertinent to the discussion that I was having. But I was always trying to get the responses to the first sort of 14 or so questions, because that gave me consistency of data. So when I look at all the transcripts, one of the things I do find when I read the transcripts is that I have asked the questions, sometimes not always in quite the order. Sometimes I sort of flip, say, sort of number 10 and number 9 around for some reason. But generally speaking, they're in the appropriate order. So it's quite easy then to, from the transcripts, find everybody's responses to a particular question, because I had structured the interview with the interview schedule. So the interview schedule is really kind of important, and the sequence and the questions and the thought into the questions are really quite important. So those of you that are going to do interviews, I would strongly encourage you to sort of sit down and really think about what questions you're going to ask. It's probably just a one shot you've got here. You've got no more time anyway, but the person probably will want to come and see you again. You may not have the opportunity to see them again, so you've got to grab all the information you can at this particular point in time. So you want to make sure this little session is so focused on your research questions and getting the data you need to answer research questions. So I would encourage you to sort of think through carefully how you generate your interview schedule. So I don't know if that helps at all, whether that helps or hinders these little discussions, but that's kind of a real exercise that I have to go through, and that's the schedule I used. But that's something to think about for you, okay? Interview schedules if you're going to interview. Okay, you're probably all asleep out there. Totally asleep out there.